The envelope was the color of weak tea, and it had been folded twice against my chest for so long that the creases had become part of my ribs. I could feel them when I breathed. I could feel them when I ran. I carried that letter for 407 days through 3 countries, 2 winters and 1 war that nobody back home seemed able to name correctly, and I never opened it. Not once. Not even the night I thought I was going to die in a barn outside a village whose name I still cannot pronounce. People ask me when they find out why I didn't read it. They ask like it's a small question. It isn't. The answer is the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. His name was Daniel. He was 22 years old. He had a laugh that sounded like someone trying not to laugh, which is the best kind, and he wrote left-handed with the page turned almost sideways, the way left-handed kids learn when nobody teaches them properly. He gave me the letter on a Tuesday. I remember it was Tuesday because we'd just gotten mail for the first time in 3 weeks, and he'd received nothing, and he made a joke about it that wasn't really a joke, and then later that night, sitting on an ammunition crate with his boots off because his feet had been wet for 6 days, he handed me a pale brown envelope and said, "If I don't make it, this goes to her." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. We all knew about her. She was the reason he'd been writing letters every other night by the light of a small red lens because white light gets you killed. She was the reason he was still mostly a person and not entirely a soldier yet. I said, okay. That was the whole agreement. 1 word on a Tuesday in a country I had no business being in, between 2 boys who were pretending to be men because the alternative was admitting how scared we actually were. And then we slept, or pretended to, and the next morning the war kept doing what wars do, which is grind everything that was once specific into something general, until you can't remember what month it is or what your mother's voice sounds like on the phone. Here's the part I want you to understand before I tell you the rest. I'm not telling you this story because it's about a war. There are 1,000 war stories, and most of them are louder than mine. I'm telling you this because of what I learned about a piece of paper, about what a piece of paper can do to a person who carries it long enough, about what happens when a promise becomes the only solid thing in a world where everything else is melting. I didn't know any of that on the Tuesday I said okay. I thought I was just doing a favor for a friend. I was wrong about almost everything that year, and that was only the first thing. The letter rode in the inside pocket of my field jacket for the first month. Then I moved it. I moved it because we got rained on for 9 days straight, and I started to imagine the ink running, and the idea of her receiving a letter that had become a smear instead of words was unbearable to me in a way I couldn't justify. So I wrapped it in a strip of plastic torn off a ration bag, and then I wrapped that in oilcloth, and then I put it in the small interior pocket sewn against the lining of my jacket, the one most guys used for cigarettes or photographs. After that I checked it. Every morning when I woke up, before I checked my rifle, before I checked my boots, before I checked whether I still had all my fingers, I pressed my hand flat against my chest and felt for the small rectangle under 3 layers of fabric. If it was there, the day could begin. If it wasn't, and there were 2 mornings when, in the half-second of panic before my fingers found it, I genuinely believed it wasn't, the day could not begin until I had it again. I want to tell you something honest. I started to need that letter more than Daniel did. That sounds like a strange thing to say about a dead man's correspondence, and I know how it sounds. But stay with me because this is the part nobody warned me about, and the part I think is actually true about being a human being in a place that wants to erase you. When you're inside a war, and I imagine this is also true of grief and of long illness and of any season of life where the floor keeps tilting, you start looking for things that don't move. Anything. A photograph, a song you remember the lyrics to, a coin from before. The brain cannot tolerate a world made entirely of variables. It needs at least one constant, one fixed point, one thing that no matter what else happens today will still be true at the end of it. The letter was my fixed point. Daniel had given it to me before everything turned into what it turned into, and as long as I still had it, some piece of that earlier world was still intact. It wasn't about him anymore, not entirely. It was about the version of me that had said okay on a Tuesday and meant it. The longer I carried it, the more I realized I wasn't keeping a promise to a friend. I was keeping a promise to the person I had been before the war started rearranging me from the inside out. And he died, of course. You already knew that. I knew it within about 30 seconds of him handing me the envelope, because the kind of person who hands you a letter for after isn't planning on coming back the same way they left, even if they don't know it yet. He died on a Thursday, 11 weeks after the Tuesday, and I wasn't there when it happened, which is something I have made peace with maybe 4 times in my life, and which comes back unmade every time I hear someone laugh the way he did. The details of his death are not the point. They are not the point because every soldier who has ever died has died in detail, and the details are not what the people back home need to know. The people back home need to know that he was 22 and left-handed and once spent an entire afternoon trying to teach a stray dog to sit, and that he failed, and that he laughed about failing, and that the dog ended up sleeping in his bunk for 2 weeks afterward because Daniel had decided the dog was a person now and persons get bunks. I found out he was gone 3 days later. We had been moved. Communication was bad. By the time the news caught up to me, I'd already crossed into another country, which is a sentence that probably sounds dramatic, but at the time felt mostly like changing buses. I sat down on a low stone wall outside a building that had once been a school and was now whatever it had become, and I put my hand against my chest and I felt the letter, and I understood in that exact second that I now had a job. The job had a deadline of the rest of my life. The job was to find her. Now here's where I have to be careful, because this is the part of the story where, if I'm not careful, it starts to sound like a movie, and it wasn't a movie. It was much slower than a movie. It was much more boring than a movie, in the way that real grief is mostly boring. Long stretches of nothing, broken by 10 seconds you can't breathe through. I didn't go on a quest. I went to my next assignment. I did my job badly for a few weeks and then better. I wrote home and didn't mention any of it. The letter stayed where it was. The job I now had, to deliver it, became something I carried alongside everything else, the way you carry the memory of a person you owe money to, except instead of money, it was the last words a man wrote to the woman he loved. I didn't know her last name. Did I mention that? I didn't know her last name. Daniel had said her first name twice, once when he was tired and once when he was almost asleep. And I had not written it down because on the Tuesday he gave me the letter I had assumed he would deliver it himself eventually. And her last name would arrive in due course, the way last names do when people fall in love and get married and become a fact instead of a hope. So I had a first name, and I had a city he had mentioned once in passing, and I had an envelope with no address on it because, and this is the detail that wrecked me later, he had been planning to write the address on it the night he died, and hadn't gotten to it. Think about that for a second. He hadn't gotten to it. You go to war assuming you'll have time for the small things. You assume the address can wait until tomorrow because tomorrow is a thing that will keep arriving. And then one tomorrow doesn't, and what you leave behind is a letter with no destination and a friend who said okay on a Tuesday. I want to tell you what was inside the letter. I can't, because I still haven't read it, but I can tell you what I started to imagine was inside it, because for 407 days my brain did what brains do, which is fill silence with story. I imagined he had written about the first time he saw her. I imagined he had written about a specific afternoon, because Daniel was the kind of person who remembered specific afternoons, and I imagined that afternoon involved a window, and a particular quality of light, and her doing something ordinary like reading or pouring tea, and him realizing in that moment that he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve her. I imagined he had apologized for something. Soldiers' last letters always apologize for something, even when they have nothing to apologize for, because going away is its own kind of leaving, and leaving feels like a thing that requires an apology. I imagined he had told her not to wait. They always tell them not to wait. They never mean it. I carried these imagined contents through a winter so cold my eyelashes froze together in the mornings. I carried them through a spring where the only flowers I saw were growing out of the cracks in a runway. I carried them through a summer where I stopped being able to remember what air conditioning felt like. And the whole time, the letter against my chest got softer and softer at the edges, the paper wearing down the way river stones wear down, until the envelope didn't really feel like an envelope anymore. It felt like a part of me. It felt like an organ I had grown specifically for this purpose. This is the part I want you to sit with for a moment because I think it's the part that actually matters. There is a thing that happens when you carry something for someone else for long enough. The thing you're carrying stops being separate from you. It enters your interior. It becomes one of the materials you are made out of. And by the time you finally arrive at the moment of handing it over, you are handing over a piece of yourself that you didn't have before the carrying began. You don't get to keep that piece. That piece was always going to belong to somebody else. But the act of carrying it, the act of being its container for as long as it needed a container, that act changes the shape of you forever. I came home in the late part of a year I would rather not name. I came home the way most of us came home, which is quietly, on a plane full of strangers, into a country that had moved on without us in ways that felt like a small betrayal, even though we knew it wasn't one. The world is supposed to keep going. That's the whole point. But you walk back into it expecting some marker, some sign that the time you were gone was real, and there isn't one, and the not having one is its own small grief. The letter was still against my chest. I had not been able to find her. I had tried in the small ways available to me at that time, the wrong numbered phone calls, the wrong addressed letters to people who had her first name, the long shots that all came back nothing. I had Daniel's family's address from his unit paperwork. I had been afraid to use it. I had been afraid because giving the letter to his family felt like the wrong delivery, like dropping a package at the wrong door, like failing the only specific instruction I had been given. But I went. I had to. You can't carry someone's last words against your chest forever. Eventually, the carrying becomes a kind of selfishness. You start to wonder if the reason you haven't delivered it is because delivering it means it ends, and you don't want it to end, because the carrying has been the closest thing you've had to him in years. So I went. His mother answered the door. I want to be careful about this part too, because I do not have the right to make her grief into a story for other people. I will only tell you this. She knew who I was before I said my name. She had seen me in his letters home. She had been hoping I would come and afraid I would, and both of those things at the same time, for almost 3 years. She let me in. We sat at a kitchen table that had a small chip in one corner, and she put her hand on my hand, and she said his name out loud in a voice that had clearly not said his name out loud in a long time. And then I told her about the letter, and about the woman it was for, and about how I had not been able to find her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she got up and she went to a drawer in another room, and she came back with a small notebook. Daniel had kept addresses in it. He had kept her address in it. She had been alive in a city 3 hours away from his mother's kitchen the entire time I had been carrying that letter through countries that did not know either of them. I drove there the next day. I want to tell you what she looked like when she opened the door, but the truth is I barely registered her face in the first second, because what I registered was the way her hand went to her mouth, and the way her body understood before her brain did, the way the human body always understands the bad news before the words arrive. She had been waiting too. She had not known what she was waiting for. But when she saw me, a stranger in a coat, holding an envelope the color of weak tea, she understood that the waiting was over and that the answer she had been hoping for had not arrived. I gave her the letter. I told her what he had said on the Tuesday. I told her my name and his unit and the date and a few other things you put on top of grief like a tablecloth to give the people receiving it something to hold while they fall apart. And then I left, because the letter was hers now, and my job was over, and standing there while she read it would have been a kind of theft.